Hello everyone. So today we're going to finish off Act 2 of An Inspector Calls, and this is the section where Mrs Birling is going to have her turn at being interrogated by Inspector Goole. So the learning questions we're going to be trying to answer at the end of today's lesson are as follows. Can I remember and explain the main messages the playwright has aimed to convey so far? So it's a real trying to recap everything we're going to start off with, and the main messages that J B Priestley, the playwright, is trying to get across. We are going to watch the play, and then we're going to do some annotation. And the point of doing annotation is the second part of the learning question. Can I analyse language structure, the themes and ideas in Act 2, where Mrs Birling is questioned? And then finally, we're going to look at the 7 deadly sins and see if we can analyse the way that Priestley uses the Birlings and Gerald to exemplify the 7 deadly sins. So to kind of look at the sins that you can see underneath on this page here, and show them in action, really. So that's what it means by exemplifying. Okay, so what I want you to do is have a look at those 7 deadly sins, which I'll go through, and think which character matches up best with each sin. So wrath is like extreme anger. Greed is where you want more money and more stuff. Envy, obviously, is where you feel intense jealousy towards somebody. Lust is where you let your sexual desires come over you. When you find yourself really, really attracted to someone and you must have them no matter what. Sloth is extreme laziness. Gluttony is when you have a really big appetite and you just keep eating and eating and eating, even like long after you are full. That's gluttony. And then finally, pride. I think that pride doesn't really need explaining, hopefully. So maybe when you are rightfully proud of what you've done, but I think for it to be considered a sin is maybe when you're being a little bit arrogant about it, when you're feeling smug because you've achieved something good. So which one goes best with Birling? Which one goes best with Sheila? Which sin goes best with Gerald? Pause for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, however long you need, and see which one you've come up with, and you can compare your answers to mine. Okay, so I've put Mr Birling down for greed, because he is a greedy businessman. He doesn't want to give his workers a pay rise, because that will cut into his profits. To him, everything is all about making money, making profit. Even Sheila's marriage to Gerald, he sees that as an opportunity to make even more money. So a real sense of greed with Mr Birling. And remember, greed is not to do with food, it's about wanting stuff. For Sheila, I've put down envy. That seems to be what caused her troubles, especially regarding Eva Smith. So because Eva Smith was so pretty, Sheila was envious of her, the inspector says, so you could say you were jealous of her. And she was very envious of Eva Smith when the fashionable item that she wanted to wear looked really good on Eva Smith, but it looked absolute disaster on Sheila. And then perhaps the fact that Gerald felt fondly towards Eva, she might have felt some envy, but I don't think she did by that point. If you put down wrath for Sheila, is intense anger, I don't think that's wrong. I think that's partially correct, but maybe not as strongly as envy, because if you remember at the beginning, Eric warns Gerald that she has a hell of a temper, and then we see her temper in action when she storms off to the manager and gets the girl dismissed from her job. So the last one is probably the trickiest one, and I've gone for gluttony. I'm thinking that lots of you probably chose lust for Gerald, and in a way I didn't choose lust because I think that works better for one of the other characters, I went for gluttony because it's like Gerald is a young man who has got, at the point where he met Daisy Renton, he had a beautiful girlfriend, Sheila, who's also described as pretty. And he had a nice relationship with Sheila. But for him, that kind of wasn't enough. He wanted more. And for me, that's more like gluttony, even though he's not actually eating. It's like this idea that he wants more, even though he's got enough in Sheila. He should have enough in Sheila in his as a relationship. He wants more. And I haven't put him for lust, because if he was lustful, he would have whisked Eva away to the county hotel and not just bought her a port and lemon and listened to her worries. He probably would have whisked her off to a hotel room that very night. But that's not what he did, and that's why I haven't gone for lust with Gerald. I've gone for gluttony instead. Okay, and hopefully in the next couple of lessons you'll see who I consider to be the lustful member of the Birling family. Okay, so the next thing in our learning objectives was let's recap, but let's focus in our recap on what the playwright's message is so far. So the first character who's interrogated by the inspector is Mr. Birling, and Mr. Birling really reveals Priestley's theme of responsibility. In fact, Birling and Sheila both really exemplify that theme of responsibility. The inspector reveals that the chain of events that led to an innocent girl's suicide was that little apostrophe is in the wrong place. It should be in there. Typing mistake. An innocent girl's suicide was started by Mr. Birling. Priestley strongly suggests that business owners have a responsibility to, 1, pay their workers fairly, 2, respect the workers' rights to take action for change, so their right to strike and take industrial action, and 3, ensure the well-being of their employees. So these are all implicit, so you have to infer that's what Priestley's message is, but I think that's what he's strongly trying to convey there. At the moment, the only person that Mr. Birling seems to show any responsibility towards are the shareholders in his business and his own purse. He wants to make profit, and he just sees his employees as a kind of an overhead, just something that has to be paid, like the rent or the mortgage on the factory, for example. Okay, so I think that J B Priestley paints Mr. Birling as a very irresponsible business leader, very irresponsible employer. Sorry. He does everything he can to keep the wages as low as possible and the profits high, and that doesn't help out the workers. It's not responsible management. And then we go from this kind of public responsibility for your workers and responsibility for the people that you employ, to Sheila, who shows a different kind of responsibility. So this one's more about personal responsibility, taking responsibility for your actions. So I've written here, through Sheila, Priestley reveals the necessity for personal responsibility, thinking through the potential outcomes of your action. The character of Sheila also helps to show how humans do have the capacity to change. So it's not depressing. When we see Sheila, we're like, oh, what she did was awful, but she's learned her lesson, and that's going to make her a much better person in the future. So she has the capacity to change, and so do other members of the audience who are watching the play, who are taking the message on board. And maybe that might prevent some people in the audience being as mean as Sheila was to someone that they come across just in their day-to-day life. So Sheila pledges never to act deliberately with a lack of personal responsibility. Again, she's going to think through her actions, and she's really prepared to change. We look at these two characters from two different generations, and Sheila takes all the responsibility on her shoulders, whereas her father, Mr. Birling, brushes off his responsibility. What he does as a business owner, he doesn't think has anything to do with the police inspector. So whilst what he does is morally irresponsible, legally it's perfectly legal what he does. Morally, what Sheila did was wrong, and morally she realizes that was wrong. She abused her power. In fact, another theme I haven't written here is both of these two abuse their power. But again, Mr. Birling abuses his power as an employer, so in the business sense, whereas Sheila abuses her personal power because her dad is wealthy and has an account with Millwoods. That's why she has the power to get an employee sacked. And then finally, Gerald. And whilst in a way, what J B Priestley is trying to teach us through Sheila and Mr. Birling is quite straightforward to follow. It's a little more complex with Gerald, isn't it? So through the character of Gerald, Priestley exposes everything that's wrong with the British class system. Now, in 1945, when the play was written and first performed, people were voting a general election. It's a little bit like the US elections, which are kind of starting to roll underway at the moment. They had the choice to vote for their war hero leader, Winston Churchill, or they could vote for Clement Attlee, the Labour candidate, who really wanted to set up an NHS and make massive social change so that the poorest and weakest in society would be cared for and looked after, and so that there would be a safety net. Whereas, as I said, Churchill wanted things to go back to this British class system, with the upper class people ruling and the middle class and the wealthy people having great privilege, and the working class people just being kept downtrodden and in their place, like if you get ill, too bad. So a real choice that the British people had there. And J B Priestley is trying to really, really persuade his audience that Clement Attlee's Labour Party are the one that they want to go with if they want this massive social change. And like I said, Gerald really reveals everything that is bad and wrong about this British class system. So he really shows that. Gerald has enormous power because he is just about upper class, so he just sneaks into the upper classes because of his mum and dad, Sir and Lady Croft, and because of his privilege and his wealth, he can rescue a young woman who's in distress, and then a few weeks later he can set her up as his mistress. As a young man, no judgment will be made against his character, so you can see that Gerald also exemplifies the sexist attitudes of the early and mid 20th century. Some of you might argue that those sexist attitudes and the way the women and men are judged haven't really changed into the 21st century as well. He knows that he can't marry this girl that he shacked up with because they have a difference in social class. I explained it last time. If he tried to marry her, he would have been cut off from his inheritance, probably his title, by his parents. So he would have brought disgrace on the family. But he's really clear. Sheila wanted to know, the inspector wanted to know, did you love her? He didn't love her anyway. So because of the story and narrative that Gerald tells, we also learn about this vile character, Alderman Joe Meggerty, who has this position of really quite high authority within Bromley. He's an alderman, because he's an alderman. We learnt last time that means one down from the Lord Mayor. Is really, really important in the way that Bromley is run. So he's probably deciding on budgets, what the money gets spent on, hiring and firing within the council. It's a job that we found out that Mr. Birling used to have. Yet we find out that he is this rogue and a sot. And from what Sheila says about her friend who barely escaped with a torn shirt, and the way that he's got Eva Smith / Daisy Renton wedged into a corner with that fat carcass of his, definitely nowadays we'd call that sexual abuse, wouldn't we? Certainly the ripped shirt anyway. And it seems that the whole of Bromley family know what he gets up to, but he still retains that important position and no one's challenging him about it. And that really shows that a woman wouldn't report him because it wouldn't be taken seriously, perhaps she wouldn't be believed, and it shows a sexist attitude of the time, but also the hypocrisy of people who are wealthy and who are in power. So still thinking about sexism, what we also learn through Gerald is that a poor working class girl without a job, there aren't many options left for her. So she seems to have kind of taken up this option that she is being kept by a wealthy man. Gerald's not engaged at this point, but he has a serious relationship with Sheila. So it's just last summer that this happened, so about six to 8 months ago. And that's what she is. She's kind of like his kept mistress. And you can imagine that many other men, maybe married men, might also do the same thing. Remember that Gerald's friend lent him that little set of rooms. For these wealthy, privileged people, men, they can easily lay their hands on some property or afford a hotel room or whatever it is they need to be able to be keeping a wife or a girlfriend and a mistress on the side. So Daisy Benton is being kept by Gerald for several months, and then kind of the next step down from that is to turn to prostitution. And this is kind of expected. We see in the section we're about to have a look at, Mrs Birling kind of expects that to be the only future. Mr Birling previously, what happened when I chucked her out of her job? Did she end up on the streets? It's kind of like you either get a really rubbish job working in a factory, or if you can't manage to do that, you end up walking the streets as a prostitute. Those are the choices for poor girls, which is disgusting. It's sexist. It shows a hypocrisy of the upper classes. And yet it's not the hypocrisy which is highlighted. It is the young girl who's in this terrible position. She's the one who gets judged. However, someone like Sheila, a middle class girl, kind of in the higher end of the middle classes, she'd be expected to be pure for her husband, and until she got married. And after she was married, then she was expected that he'd be the only partner that she'd have for the rest of her life, even though men were carrying on with prostitutes or mistresses or whatever. So if we have a look underneath, just to summarise, Gerald does take some responsibility for Daisy's welfare, but probably mainly because she was pretty and he was very attracted to her. If she'd been ugly, he probably wouldn't have taken her on. However, he reveals hypocrisy. 1, men; 2, the wealthy; 3, the upper classes. The fact that the upper classes can get away with anything. Okay, so what I want you to do now for me, please, is to watch the next 11 minutes of the play. As usual, I'll put the link in the description below. I'll put the link in the info tab just above. And whilst you're watching, as usual, please follow along with your script. Most of it's really, really similar to the script, but especially towards the end of this section, there are a few lines which are cut out and slightly changed. So be following along in your script. And as you're watching too, try to think about those 7 deadly sins. I think in what we've got left, we've got the sloth, the laziness, we've got the pride, we have got the wrath left. So which one of those, or something else that I might have missed, does Mrs Birling match up to best? I will see you back here in about 11 minutes. If, however, you've been pausing the video and taking some notes as we've been going, after you watch the video, that might be a good place to stop for the end of this lesson and then start afresh with some annotation in the next session that you do. So I will either see you back here in about 10 and a bit minutes, or I'll see you back here tomorrow. Okay, so it is annotation time. So let's have a look at this annotation. Don't forget to make sure you've got your copy of the text in front of you so that you can annotate. Whichever version you're using, maybe make your notes in pencil if you go wrong. I've kind of put the very bare minimum up here, so as I'm talking, if you've got room, you might want to make extra notes or make some notes in your exercise book to go alongside these. So Mrs Birling starts off asking about the photograph. You have a photograph of this girl, so she is quite curious, clearly, to begin with, but then when the inspector invites her to look at it, I don't see any particular reason why I should. She denies that she's curious. So clearly she is, but then she denies it. So she wants to be involved, but she's really trying to have the upper hand over the inspector. So Mrs Birling has a look at the photo and she says she doesn't recognise it. And the inspector says, I can't believe she could have changed so much. And straight away, what we see with the inspector is he starts echoing the kind of words that Mrs Birling uses, the kind of phrasing that Mrs Birling uses. So if we have a look at this little section, I can't believe she could have changed so much. And in what follows, Mrs Birling keeps saying she didn't believe Eva Smith, Daisy Renton. I didn't believe her. She told me a pack of lies. And the inspector keeps saying to Mrs Birling, well, actually, I don't believe you. So it's kind of like he's turning her own words back onto her. Mrs Birling says, I don't understand you, Inspector. And the inspector says, I mean, you don't choose to, Mrs Birling. So again, you can see these speech patterns really, really echoing and repeating. And then Mrs Birling gets angry. I meant what I said. And the inspector, he's quite angry too. You're not telling me the truth. And again, you can imagine that this is how Mrs Birling probably spoke to Eva Smith in that charity hearing when Eva went there to try to get some money to help herself out. So again, this ties in with the idea that the inspector is a little bit like the conscience of the Birlings. At the beginning, they'd all done these things which are coming out now. They'd all done them, but the bad things that they'd done in their past didn't seem to be troubling their conscience. And the inspector comes in and he is like being the conscience that they didn't have, really. He's like that kind of, like, I would say the angel and the devil on their shoulders, but actually it's like the angel on their shoulders, or the ghoul who's trying to draw out their souls and getting them to confess. So again, the inspector has changed his style, so this time he's sounding like Mrs Birling. And then off Mrs Birling for a minute, the inspector turns on Mr Birling. Again, we've got this key theme. Public men, Mr Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. So that's what we were just discussing, really, wasn't it? So the responsibility to the welfare of your employees, the responsibility to make sure your employees get paid fairly, and that they have the right to ask for a pay rise. Mr Birling doesn't even fully agree with what the inspector's saying, though he says possibly. So he doesn't think that he does have responsibilities. There's definitely a feeling of that. Mr Birling says, you didn't come here to talk about my responsibilities. And Sheila says, let's hope not, because she knows that if the inspector was there to inspect Mr Birling's responsibilities, Mr Birling would not come out of that very well, because he isn't a responsible business owner, is he? And then we noticed last time that Sheila really seems to be taking over the inspector's role. At the beginning, it would be the inspector who kind of sum up what had happened so far. And Sheila has started taking that role on. So this is what she says. Father threw this girl out because she asked for decent wages. I went and pushed her father out right into the street just because I was angry and she was pretty. Gerald set her up as his mistress and then dropped her when it suited him. She is running out of patience with her mother, just like the inspector does in a couple of minutes, actually. In the meantime, they hear a door bang, and it seems like it's Eric who's gone out. And you'll see that Mrs Birling worries about that a lot a little bit further down. Okay, so let's have a look at this page then. The inspector starts talking directly to Mrs. Birling. Mrs. Birling, you're a prominent member of the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation, aren't you? So the first thing to note is the word prominent means an important member, an influential member. So it's an important role for Mrs. Birling. I have put the link in the description box underneath to the article that the website I wanted you to look at about roles for women in Edwardian society. And for Mrs. Birling, this is kind of really important. She would certainly not be allowed to go out for work. So probably, although she's a cold woman, she's not a very pleasant woman. She does seem to be quite an intelligent woman, and she wants an outlet to be able to channel that. She's got a cook and a housekeeper and a maid, so it's not like she's busy around the house. So working for a charity would be something that she'd be able to do in the Edwardian era. Now, when we read A Christmas Carol, it seemed that Mr. Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig were very much living in that community. By Edwardian times, because the suburbs had developed as the desirable place for the middle classes to live, that very much distanced the business, which would be in the city centre, from the domestic, from the home. And that meant that as a wife, you couldn't kind of pop in and see your husband at work throughout the day and kind of be maybe a little presence at work, maybe occasionally bringing something nice for all the workers for lunch, being part of the community, like many Victorian factory owners. The wives of Victorian factory owners might have been able to make that kind of contribution and be a part of that business. Because the domestic and the work life had been separated, these wives found themselves with nothing to do and no role, so they kind of got very much into volunteering. And a bit like Sheila and her shopping that we talked about previously, Mrs. Birling finds that she can have power and influence and importance by being a member of a charitable organisation. And it certainly does give her power. And again, we're going to see this abuse of power. You've seen it on the video. So roles for women, a prominent member of the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation. I just noticed here really quickly that Sheila is not mummy anymore, it's mother. And actually, I like the way that the actress in the video plays Sheila. Sheila is very strong, very firm, and she's not kind of playing up to her mum anymore. She's talking to her really, really strictly, like on terms as if they're equals now. So Mrs. Birling answers the inspector. Women of distress can appeal to your charity for help in various forms. She replies with dignity. And she says, we've done a great deal of useful work in helping deserving cases. And I thought that this adjective deserving was really interesting, because who decides who is deserving of charity and who is not deserving of charity? Surely, if you're in trouble, your need is equal. But actually, this is how Mrs. Birling gets to wield her power. She has the decision to make who is deserving and who isn't. So being able, if you're going in there to ask for help from the charity, being able to know how to play someone like Mrs. Birling is really important. And when Eva Daisy went in there, she did not know how to play the game at all, which arguably could highlight her innocence. So she's probably more deserving than many of the women who go in there and play the game just right. So the inspector talks about the meeting, which was 2 weeks ago, which is significant. You know, there was a meeting there, Mrs. Birling. You were in the chair, so she would have been the chairman of that meeting. She was in charge of that meeting. She would have been asking the questions, and she would have been making the final decision about whether Eva Smith was a deserving case or not. Mr. Birling finds out that Eric is missing, and what this serves to do is to remind the audience how much of a mummy's boy Eric is how much Mrs. Birling absolutely adores her son Eric. And this is so important because it's her adoration for Eric that the inspector is going to use against her, isn't it? Okay, so she really cares for Eric. I've put, have you been up to his room? Mr. Birling says it must have been Eric we heard go out. So we're getting clues. You might call it foreshadowing. So Eric's gone out. Why has Eric gone out? It's giving us a hint as to what is going to happen later. Mrs. Birling talks about him as if he's a child, not even a teenager, like a little child. Silly boy, where can he have gone to? And again, this is significant because, as the inspector points out a bit later, he's not a boy, he's a young man. Birling talks about Eric and says he was in one of his excitable, queer moods. And that makes me think that Eric is quite a complex character. He doesn't just follow the family. He doesn't just go along with what mother and father tell him to do. He is his own man, but that seems to have manifested itself in him drinking too much. The inspector cuts in sharply, and cutting in sharply is like a warning, and he goes on to say, we do need him here. So again, he's given to both the audience and to Mr. and Mrs. Birling a massive hint as to what's going to be revealed a little bit later on. And Birling, Mrs. Birling, they exchange bewildered and frightened glances. Don't forget, when you're writing about a drama, to explore the stage directions. So bewildered means they look really, really confused, and frightened means they're looking a bit scared. And that doesn't seem like the arrogant Birlings that we've met for most of the play. The inspector speaks severely, and this adverb we see, what it means is really strict. So when you speak severely, you're speaking really strictly. And Mrs. Birling uses this word later on in this section. And we've got another massive clue as to what's coming up. I'll explain why. That is why he needs Eric when you've answered my questions, Mrs. Birling. So the inspector keeps telling Mrs. Birling that it's very important that Eric stays in the house because he needs to speak to him. And this really makes Mrs. Birling look a bit silly in what's coming up, doesn't it? Okay, so I put here a theme is time, but actually time is more of a motif, slightly different. So this idea about time does keep popping up. We haven't got much time, hurry up, get a move on, that kind of thing. And here we see time. Mrs. Birling spoke to Eva Smith. She saw her only 2 weeks ago. This is a really, really short time frame. So what Mrs. Birling did and said 2 weeks ago, Sheila realises is going to have a massive impact on Eva Smith's decision to take her own life. So I've just put here S for Sheila. Sheila realises the impact of her mother's actions. So whatever it was her mum did or didn't do is so close, just 2 weeks close to the suicide of Eva Smith. And it really makes her mum look guilty. It makes her mum look culpable. Mr. Birling says, is this true? And Mrs. Birling pauses. So again, remember to explore the stage directions. Mrs. Birling pauses. Yes, quite true. Was she thinking about lying there? She decides to be honest. I think she realizes she has to be honest, exactly as Sheila warned her. So in that pause, though, she's deciding whether to pursue the truth or whether to continue with her lies, which is kind of ironic since she accused Eva Smith of lying, and that was one of the main reasons why she didn't get her help. Okay. So she didn't introduce herself as Eva Smith, Daisy Wren. Mrs. Birling says first she called herself Mrs. Birling. So this is probably our most massive hint or clue so far. Why would the name Mrs. Birling have popped into her head? Why? Because she knows it's Eric who has got her pregnant. So, and she probably knows Eric's name and surname's Birling. And that's why it pops into her head. Mrs. Birling just doesn't get this at all. And she starts talking about her as being impertinent, a piece of gross impertinence, so like really, really cheeky. She did it deliberately, and that prejudiced her against the case. So some really key Mrs. Birling vocabulary here. Mrs. Birling almost seems proud. You admit being prejudiced against her case, yes. So she's really blunt, and that does make her seem quite proud. Is admitting to being prejudiced a good thing? No. If someone accused me of being prejudiced, I would be very upset, especially if I thought it was unfair. But Mrs. Birling's even accusing herself of being prejudiced. It seems that someone like Mrs. Birling doesn't see that that's something to be ashamed of. So Mrs. Birling carries on. I didn't like her manner because she influenced them, the committee, not to allow the money. I didn't like her manner. She'd impertinently made use of our name. She pretended it just happened to be the first name she thought of. And I put why, there's another clue there. And I've mentioned that already. So we've got this theme again, haven't we? It's an abuse of power. Mrs. Birling decides not to help out this poor girl who is desperate because she didn't like her looks, she didn't like her personality, she didn't like the way she spoke. I didn't like her manner. And that's all it took. She didn't care what the girl said next, just because she's judged her like really, really instantly. So it's this idea of abuse of power. Mrs. Birling is not making an objective decision. She's making a subjective decision because she's taken against this girl. So real abuse of power here. And then she uses a list of 3, all of Eva's kind of crimes, if you like, or her lies. Let's have a look at the list of 3. She wasn't married. The story she told about her husband who deserted her was quite false. And what was the first one? She had no claim to the name Mrs. Birling. So the 3 kind of crimes of Eva Smith are 3 things that prejudiced Mrs. Birling against her there. And then when Mrs. Birling says this, it didn't take me long to get to the truth. Definitely I've seen this acted out as her being very proud and very smug. It's almost like she's kind of some lady detective here, some Miss Marple kind of character. She's proved how clever she is to the other members of the committee by breaking this girl's story. Now, the whole point is Eva Smith would have made up a story because she is so desperate and so in need of help. But Mrs. Birling can't see or understand that at all. And she's just feeling so pleased with herself because she has found out the truth, this girl's pack of lies as she sees them. The inspector wants to know why she wanted help. And we've got the echoes of the speech style. You know very well why she wanted help. No, I don't. I know why she needed help. But as I wasn't there, I don't know why she asked for it. And I noticed that the inspector, no, I don't. He's being really blunt, really rude, just like Mrs. Birling is being to him and to everyone she meets, probably. And here he goes again. You have no hope of not discussing it, Mrs. Birling, blunt and rude. Okay, so if we have a look, we find out a little bit more detail about Mrs. Birling's power and how she's able to abuse it. We were asked to look carefully into the claims made upon us. So the charity is probably run by a man, and Mrs. Birling has been given this responsibility of looking carefully into the claims. But she's not looking into the claim to find out how much the girl is in need. She's looking into the claim and judging this girl on her perceived morality. She seemed to me not a good case. Well, we've seen why. It's because Mrs. Birling judged her to be an immoral girl because she was unmarried. She considered her to be immoral because she lied to her. And she was not a good case because she was a bit cheeky and a bit impertinent. And this way, again, Mrs Birling uses her influence, her abuse of power here. So the inspector says he does have the power to make her change her mind. Mrs Birling is absolutely insistent. I've done nothing wrong. And she says, and you know it. It's almost like she is gloating. She's so proud of herself here. So we've got this kind of key idea which keeps popping up. So no, legally, Mrs Birling has done absolutely nothing wrong, has she? Legally, she hasn't broken any laws. She hasn't broken any rules. But morally, what she's done is really wrong. A desperate girl has ended up committing suicide because Mrs Birling refused her help when she needed it most. So yeah, she's not legally wrong. I've done nothing wrong, but morally she is wrong, and that's what the inspector wishes to prove. Right, so the inspector says, I think you did something terribly wrong and that you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. Now, that's quite some statement, isn't it? That you did something terribly wrong and you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. And remember, right back to the beginning, Eric says to his dad, what about war? And his dad says the Germans don't want war. Remember that it's 1912 and World War I is only 2 years away. Is Eric going to grow up enough to find a girl of his own class and get married and have babies within those 2 years? Unlikely, I would suggest. And what if, like millions of young men of Eric's age, what if he dies in World War I? Well, Mrs Birling will not have a grandson by Eric, will she? And remember, Eric is her little boy. And if she'd had a grandson or a granddaughter by Eric, she'd have another one to adore and to be her little boy. And because of her actions, if Eric does go ahead and die during World War I, she's just killed her only, what could possibly be her only link back to Eric, if that happens. And like I said, so many mothers lost their sons during World War I, that terrible conflict. When we look at the role of the inspector, some people interpret that he's some kind of a time traveller. And remember that time is such an important motif in this play, and it is something that J B Priestley is absolutely fascinated by. Remember that J B Priestley invited lots of his own comrades from World War I to sit in the audience for the London premiere of this play. He's thinking this, Eric's not going to survive through World War I, and Mrs Birling possibly has thrown away her chance of having a little grandchild by whom to remember Eric. So the inspector goes on to say, remember, this girl was going to have a child. Obviously, Mrs Birling knew that, but the rest of the family did not know that. Sheila responds, oh, how horrible, horrible. How could she have wanted to kill herself? Now, if you think to yourself, Sheila, for her, this is her role, isn't it? She's made herself look pretty. She's managed to get herself a Gerald. Although she's kind of lost Gerald at the moment, but she has been brought up to think, I've got to find a husband, and then when I find a husband, I've got to have some babies. So for Sheila, this is like her sole kind of purpose in life, and she can't understand how someone so desperate, so poor, someone who's kind of fallen so low that they would want to end their own life, when this pretty girl is going to have a baby who she would adore, because obviously that's all that Sheila has been brought up to. Birling, again, doesn't seem too worried about the fact that it's not just one life that's been lost, it's kind of one life and the life of an unborn baby as well. He's more worried about scandal. Look here, this wasn't Gerald Croft, which would be the last thing from my mind, I think, at that point. And now I would say that any foreshadowing or any clues or hints which have been dropped, is turning into dramatic irony at this point. When did you realise that Eric was the lazy young man that they were talking about, the drunken young man that Mrs Birling was telling us all about? I'm going to bet it's just around about this little section here that the penny is starting to drop for you guys in the audience. So Mrs Birling says, go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility. So we're back to this theme of responsibility. Who's responsible? In this section, I'm really noticing the pronouns. And the inspector really uses one of our favourite persuasive devices, direct address. So he keeps talking to you, Mrs Birling, you. So let's have a look. I've highlighted them all and put arrows. I'll probably even miss some as well. It's his responsibility, the father of the child. That doesn't make it any the less yours. She came to you, there's one I missed straight away, for help at a time when no woman could have needed it more. And you not only refused it yourself, but saw to it that the others refused it too. She was here alone, friendless, almost penniless, desperate. She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy, friendliness. You've had children. You must have known what she was feeling, and you slammed the door in her face. So it's like you. And there is nothing good in that little section there that Mrs Birling, you have done. It's all horrible things that she's done. And then we have a look at the contrasting personal pronoun, she. She came to you for help. She's desperate and she needs help. She's not doing anything wrong. She was here, and we've got a list of 3. No, it's not a list of 3, it's more than 3. It's a list of 4, but it's that incrementum again, remember? Alone, friendless, almost penniless, desperate. Remember incrementum, it starts off bad and it gets even worse, building up to that last one, desperate. And then we get some hope. So another list of 3, which I haven't highlighted here. She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy, friendliness. So these are the nice things that Mrs Birling could have done, given her some advice, felt sorry for her, shown a friendly face. Did Mrs Birling do that? No, Mrs Birling was gloating because she'd managed to catch her out in her lies and deceits, hasn't she? And then you've got a contrast. You've had children. You must have known what she was feeling. So here the inspector is really trying to look into Mrs Birling's soul. Imagine if you'd have been pregnant with Sheila. We've got that dark mirror thing going on again. How would you feel if you'd have been pregnant with Sheila and you had no money and no man to look after you and no family around you to help you out and give you advice? So he's really turning it back onto Mrs Birling. And then he ends with, well, it could be a metaphor, but it could be reality. Actually, you slammed the door in her face. It's really emotive, whether Mrs Birling went goodbye now and slammed the door literally in her face, or whether he's just been more metaphorical, like off you go now, you know, and the door representing like there's no way back, you can't turn around and have another go. Sheila judges her mum really harshly, cruel and vile. So vile means like disgusting thing to do, and cruel suggests that her mother did it on purpose because she'd taken against this girl. Mr Birling again is worried about his reputation, and he's worried about a scandal. He says the press might easily take it up, and you can imagine that nowadays, can't you? So again, because Eva Smith is beautiful, she's vulnerable, that really would play out well in the tabloid papers, like the gossip papers. All the people of Brumley would know how disgustingly, how cruelly and how vilely Mrs Birling had acted. And again, she's right, like she says on the previous page, I've done nothing wrong. Not legally, no, but morally you have, and the papers will judge you, the media will judge you. So Mrs Birling is the first person to do this. Gerald doesn't do it. Sheila definitely doesn't do it, but Mrs. Birling starts to turn on the others. Before you start accusing me of anything, it wasn't I who had her turned out of her employment, which began it all. She previously didn't think that either of the kids had done anything wrong. Sorry, not the kids, Sheila and her husband. She said that they hadn't done anything wrong. She's changed her tune now. So this idea of sharing the responsibility is something that we're coming back to again. But instead of trying to share the responsibility with the others, she's just trying to put all the responsibility on the others. Anyway, she goes on, if he'd refused to marry her, the father of the child, and in my opinion, he ought to be compelled to. So she thinks that Eva Smith should be marching the young man down the aisle and forcing a marriage upon them. Then he must at least support her. Why might the father not be able to support her? Well, he might be married. It could be because they're from different classes. I mean, that's the main reason. Actually, we find out a bit later the reason why she wouldn't marry Eric was because she thought Eric was such a silly young man that she didn't think he was mature enough to marry, so she'd rather be desperate and starving than marry him anyway. And Mrs. Birling, anyway, didn't even believe why she wouldn't get married, why she wouldn't take any money off this young man. What did she reply to that? Silly nonsense. Whatever it was, I know it made me lose all patience with her. She won't admit what it was the girl said, because I think she's beginning to realise that she is actually wrong. And then she says she was giving herself ridiculous airs. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. Now, when she says a girl in her position, this makes me think, what's she talking about? The fact that she's working class? Is she talking about the fact that she is pregnant and unmarried? Or is she talking about the fact that it's kind of all of those things? She is unmarried and pregnant. But basically what Mrs. Birling is saying here is, if you find yourself in a position of being single and being pregnant and being poor, then you don't have the right to any kind of morality. You're not entitled to be able to distinguish between right and wrong in your life. You're not entitled to be allowed to have morality or decency in your life. So what a disgusting thing for Mrs. Birling to say. And here I'm going to remind you all again what I said, that people like Mrs. Birling, the upper classes and the top of the middle classes, they believe that working class people, they truly believe that working class people were like a different species of human beings, like totally different species, and that their brains were different in such a way that they couldn't feel the same emotions. They don't have the same kind of morality as upper class people, which is absolutely ridiculous, but it's genuinely what they believed. Okay, so the inspector gets really angry with Mr. Birling. Don't stammer and yammer at me again, man. I'm losing all patience with you people. So it's that time, like, I haven't got the time, so get a move on. And the word cowed means she's like a bit cowardly. She's kind of pulled away. She's been put down. She's a bit scared, and she's been put in her place. She said that, and here we've got a real dramatic irony. Just to remind you again, dramatic irony is when the audience knows something that the character on the stage does not know, or the audience here is probably, at this point, I think, worked it out. The father was only a youngster, silly and wild, and drinking too much. There couldn't be any question of marrying him. It would be wrong for them both. So that's that class thing. So if we link back here, these are the elaborate fine feelings, scruples, and the ridiculous airs that Mrs. Birling said that she shouldn't be allowed to have these. Mrs. Birling didn't believe a word of it about why she wouldn't take the money from him. Again, she won't say why, she just calls it a fancy reason. And she says, as if a girl of that sort. So what does she mean again? Does she mean a prostitute? Does she mean a working class girls? Or is she suggesting that all working class girls are prostitutes if they're not working in a factory or a shop? Oh, she's a horrible woman, isn't she? It's a really good, convincing character, though. And then it is revealed something he said one night when he was drunk that gave her the idea it wasn't his money. So he'd stolen the money, and that's why she didn't take it anymore. So she wouldn't marry him because he's silly and wild. She wouldn't take money from him because she believed it was stolen and she didn't want to be involved in that. The inspector checks really carefully. She'd come to you for assistance because she didn't want to take stolen money. So he's checking what Mrs. Birling is saying, checking it off. The inspector says, if her story was true, if this boy had been given stolen money, then she came to you for help because she wanted to keep this youngster out of any more trouble. Isn't that so? So basically what this means to us, because we know what's going to happen, Eva wanted to protect Eric. And look at the language that the inspector uses to describe the young man. A boy, this youngster. And again, remember what I said about him, okay? And it's exactly the kind of language that Mrs. Birling would use to describe her son, Eric, isn't it? This boy, this youngster. So again, hopefully the audience has got the point now. So we've got this dramatic irony just being piled on and on and on. Mrs. Birling says it sounded ridiculous to me, and I think I've done it quite a lot in green actually. But if you go through this section, you can find all the words and phrases in the section to show the extent to which Mrs. Birling didn't believe any of Eva's story, even though actually the bulk of her story is absolutely spot on true. And even the lies that she made up, for example, calling herself Mrs. Birling, that was very close to the truth because her partner obviously was Eric at the time, who is Mr. Birling, or Master Birling. And here Mrs. Birling is blaming the father for everything. Secondly, I blame the young man who was the father of the child she was going to have. If, as she said, he didn't belong to her class, so that's the airs and scruples from the previous page, and was some drunken young idler, then that's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. He should be made an example of. So the dramatic irony is coming thick and fast. Remember that Sheila told them all about Eric drinking maybe only about 15-20 minutes ago in the play. The inspector presses on. If her story is true that he was stealing money, so again, she thinks Eva's lying. There's no point in assuming that. She's not. But suppose we do, then he'd be entirely responsible. And so we know now as young Eric, don't we? And the audience definitely starting to work that out. The inspector says, so he's the chief culprit anyhow. And can you see here what's going on here? I'll put a laughing face here, although I do feel sorry for Eric. The inspector hurts Mrs. Birling in the way it will hit hardest. Not at her because she thinks she's always right and she hasn't done anything illegal. But imagine all of this coming out about Eric, her boy, when she goes to that charity, when she's meeting her friends for coffee mornings or afternoon tea, she's probably boasting about Eric all the time in her own deluded way, her little boy, her silly boy, Eric. Imagine if this came out in public that he was, that he'd got a girl who was working class, pregnant, and then stole money to try and look after her. And that will hurt Mrs. Birling the most. This boy that she adores, her son, being taken down in public like she's talking about. So Sheila has got it, hasn't she? He ought to be dealt with very severely. Mother, stop. Sheila suddenly realised that they are talking about Eric. Do you remember I said about that word severely when you're being really, really strict? And that's how Mrs. Birling taught Sheila. You're behaving like a hysterical child tonight. She gets really, I put rude and haughty, really arrogant. And the reason why the playwright makes her rude and haughty and arrogant is a structural technique and a rhetorical, a persuasive writing technique. We've got the contrast. So when Inspector Gould takes her down, she's going to look even more stupid, isn't she? So they say pride comes before a fall, and she is so proud of herself, saying everything is the boy's fault. Not my fault at all, and I've proved it to you, Inspector. And she's so pleased with herself. If you take some steps to find this young man, make sure he's compelled to confess in public. Instead of staying here asking unnecessary questions, then you really would be doing your duty, she says. The inspector's grim, and that's because he's hanging around to do his business, and he's waiting, looking at his watch, that motif of time, remember, for Eric to come back. Mrs. Birling is triumphant. She speaks triumphantly, so she really, really thinks she's won this argument against the inspector. The inspector, sort of looking at his watch, probably is going, no hushing up, eh? Make an example of the young man, eh? Public confession of responsibility, And he's using what we call tag questions here. So he's really stressing that list of 3, and he's summing up what Eric's punishment should be, according to Sybil Birling. No hushing up, make an example of a public confession. Mrs. Birling also previously said that the young man should be compelled to marry Eva Smith as well, didn't she? Well, off you go then. Say good night, says Mrs. Birling, still feeling quite triumphant and quite proud. Not yet, I'm waiting for it to do my duty. And now Sheila's like, okay, Mum, this is why I'm upset. Don't you see, Mother? Surely, I mean, it's ridiculous. And you can see the use of ellipses to create the pauses there. She stops and exchanges a frightened glance with her husband. So the effect of that adjective, she's terrified. Birling's terrified. Look, Inspector, you're not trying to tell me that my boy is mixed up in this? And now he's stern, isn't he? A little bit like that, severe. If he is, we know what to do, don't we? Mrs. Birling has just told us. So it's going to hurt Mrs. Birling more than Eric, because Eric, I think, has been longing to get this off his chest. He's been upset since the beginning of the play. We've got a stage direction for Birling, thunderstruck. So what would someone's facial expression look like if they've been caught in a thunderstorm, if thunder comes across their face? So have a think about that. You could zoom in on that stage direction there. How would his voice sound as well? Mrs. Birling is agitated. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. She wouldn't believe anything Eva Smith said either. She's not very good at believing people. I mean, look at the language of lies and truth in this section too. And that's the end, isn't it? So it's a real in comes Eric, looking extremely pale and distressed. He meets her inquiring stares, and the curtain falls quickly. It's one of those moments, isn't it? So there it goes. And if you have a look at our little Freytag's pyramid, Freytag's triangle here, we've got through our rising action. I would argue at the end of Act 2, a third of the way through this play, we have reached our climax. This is kind of the most thrilling moment in the play. It's scandalous, isn't it? And Mrs. Birling has just absolutely dropped herself in it. So back in 1945, they probably had 2 intervals, one after each act. So here we've got an interval for the audience, a second one. Even if you went to see in spectacles nowadays, this is very likely where the interval will come, even with only 1 interval. And I tell you what, as an audience, going out for your gin and tonic or your glass of wine at your fancy night out at the theatre, there is plenty to discuss about what's just happened in that scene, isn't there? So J B Priestley really thinking about the impact of the interval on the audience there. So the next bit is called the denouement in a crime drama, and that's when, as part of the falling action, we're going to find out exactly what happened between Eric and the girl, like so that we get the final piece of the jigsaw. But our denouement in his spectacles has got a real twist to it. So that's the end of that. Which of the 7 deadly sins does Mrs Birling represent? Pause if you need to, but you probably don't need to, because I think that this one is fairly obvious. Mrs Birling shows pride, and it's not good pride as in I'm so proud of Eric, look at everything that he's done, isn't he wonderful? It's bad pride. She's proud of herself. She's proud because she caught out Eva Smith and telling a pack of lies. She's proud because she thinks that she has bested the inspector and got the better of him. And then, as I said previously, and as people often say, pride comes before a fall. So J B Priestley has absolutely set her up for that one. So pride is the one of the 7 deadly sins that Mrs Birling represents. So as a challenge, have a go at looking closely at that scene, at your annotations, remind yourself of the scene, watch it again maybe, and write an analytical paragraph arguing that Mrs Birling represents the deadly sin of pride, and explaining where she shows herself to be proud and how J B Priestley uses structure to bring her crashing to the floor. Okay, so underneath the task, underneath the video, beg your pardon, is a link to the video that you've been watching, another link to that article about roles for Edwardian women, and finally there is a crossword on Mrs Birling that you can do as well. So have a great week, and we'll find out exactly what dear old Eric has been up to next time. Bye.